Welcome to Book Central Inside the Pages. I'm your host, Abbie, and today's episode holds a special significance. We're discussing Remembrance Day, a time for reflection, for gratitude, and for paying respects to the people who sacrificed so much. It's a day that unites us in remembrance, whether through ceremonies, wearing poppies, or simply in our own quiet ways. I'm delighted to be joined by someone who brings such depth and compassion to this topic, my good friend and military historian, Dennis Brooks. Dennis is a best-selling author who has a remarkable way of connecting readers with history on a personal level. Dennis, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Abbie. It's always wonderful to be here with you, and I think it's safe to say that both of us feel this is more than just a podcast episode. Remembrance Day is something that touches so many lives, whether directly or indirectly, and it's an honor to be able to share some thoughts and memories with you and your listeners.
Absolutely. Every year, as Remembrance Day approaches, it brings back memories, not just of those who've served, but of personal family connections, stories, and even conversations with people we've lost. It's like a bittersweet gathering of memories that lingers with us. So, Dennis, to start us off, could you share what Remembrance Day means to you on a personal level?
Oh, Abbie, that's a wonderful question, and I think for me, Remembrance Day is so much more than just a date on the calendar. It's a responsibility, really. A duty to remember, to reflect, and to give thanks to those who have sacrificed in ways many of us can't even imagine. I often think of my grandfather, who served in World War II. He wasn't one for grand speeches or dwelling on the past, but the stories he did share were like windows into a world I could never fully understand. I remember him talking about the camaraderie, but also the moments of fear and loss. He once told me, "Those who don't come back aren't forgotten, they're carried with us." And I think that's the essence of Remembrance Day for me. It's about carrying those memories forward, giving them life even after the people themselves have gone.
That's beautiful, Dennis, and so true. For me, it's similar. My dad served in the Royal Green Jackets, and while he rarely spoke of his experiences, Remembrance Day was different. It was like he could finally allow himself to remember, to bring out those hidden stories just for that day. He'd tell us little snippets, not always the heroic moments, but the human ones. I think it's those small, intimate memories that bring the past alive for us. Do you think it's that personal connection that makes Remembrance Day resonate so deeply, even with people who might not have family who served?
Absolutely, Abbie. I think when we hear these stories, whether from family members or through books, documentaries, or even from people we don't know, we see the humanity behind the history. War isn't just a series of dates and battles, it's made up of individual lives. People with dreams, fears, and friendships. When you hear these personal stories, it stops being an abstract concept and becomes something deeply personal. It's one of the reasons I wrote Footsteps of the Fallen. I wanted to share those voices, to make it feel real for people who might not have that direct family connection.
And you've done that so brilliantly. The way you write about not just the bravery, but the vulnerability and the everyday moments, it's what makes your work stand out. So, tell us, Dennis, what inspired you to write Footsteps of the Fallen? It's such a moving collection. Did you always know you wanted to write about these individual experiences?
Thank you, Abbie. Footsteps of the Fallen was definitely a labor of love, but it wasn't something I'd always planned. It was a project that grew over time. I've always been fascinated by history, but the more I read, the more I realized that so many of the voices from these conflicts were missing. We often hear about the generals, the politicians, the larger strategies, but the everyday soldiers, the nurses, the families waiting at home, they don't get their stories told as often. And so, I started reaching out, interviewing veterans, families, and even archivists who've worked tirelessly to preserve these histories. I wanted to give them a platform, to tell their truths without glorifying or simplifying it. War is complex, it's brutal, and yet, in the midst of it, you find moments of humanity. That's what I wanted to capture.
And you did, Dennis. Readers feel it on every page. Now, I know part of your research for the book took you to some of these historical sites and memorials. I imagine standing on those grounds, knowing what happened there, must have had a profound impact on you. How did visiting these places change your perspective on Remembrance Day?
Oh, it changed everything, Abbie. Visiting these sites is like stepping into a time capsule. You feel this overwhelming sense of reverence. There's a heaviness to it, but also a kind of quiet peace. I remember standing in a war cemetery in Normandy and just being struck by the rows upon rows of headstones. Each one represented a life, a story cut short. And when you're there, it's impossible not to feel the gravity of it. You realize that these places aren't just historical markers, they're sacred. They hold the memories, the last moments of so many. It's humbling, and it reminds you of why Remembrance Day is so important. It's a way to say, we see you, we haven't forgotten.
That's such a powerful image. I think for anyone who hasn't visited these sites, it can be difficult to fully grasp what it's like. It's more than just history, it's a shared heritage, a shared grief even. I think that's why Remembrance Day resonates on such a deep level. And, Dennis, for people who want to honor this day but maybe don't know how, what would you suggest? How can civilians like us pay our respects in a meaningful way?
I think the simplest acts are often the most profound. Start by observing the 2-minute silence. At 11 a.m., just take that pause. Whether you're alone or in a crowd, let yourself feel the weight of that silence. It's powerful, and it's a way to show respect without words. Beyond that, I encourage people to learn, to educate themselves about what these soldiers went through. Even just reading a memoir or watching a documentary can be a way to connect. And if you can, attend a Remembrance Day service. There's something incredibly moving about standing with others, united in a common purpose, even if it's just for a few minutes.
That's a wonderful suggestion, Dennis. And for those who might not feel that personal connection to Remembrance Day, maybe because they don't have family who served or feel that it's distant from their lives, how would you encourage them to engage with it?
I'd say that Remembrance Day isn't just for those with a direct connection to the military. It's a day for everyone, because the freedoms we enjoy today are, in many ways, a legacy of those who came before us. It's about gratitude, even if it's just recognizing the sacrifices others made so that we could live the way we do. It's not so much about glorifying war as it is about acknowledging the cost of peace. So, even if you feel distant from it, take a moment to reflect on that.
Wonderfully said, Dennis. It's a reminder that we're all connected to this legacy, even if indirectly. Now, for those looking to get involved beyond just the silence, do you have any suggestions on how people can actively participate in Remembrance Day?
Definitely. One way is to volunteer with veterans organizations. There are so many ways to give back, spending time with veterans, listening to their stories, or even helping with events. Another option is simply to share stories. Talk to a family member who served or read a veteran's memoir and share it with others. And let's not forget, for those who enjoy reading, books are a powerful tool. There are so many incredible works out there that bring these stories to life.
That's a great idea, Dennis. And before we wrap up, I'd love for you to share one story that stuck with you from your research or personal experiences. Something our listeners can carry with them as they go into Remembrance Day.
I'd be happy to, Abbie. There's a story that's always stayed with me. During my research, I interviewed an elderly gentleman who served as a young soldier during World War II. He told me about a moment after a particularly intense battle. His best friend had just been killed, and he was sitting alone in the quiet aftermath. He said that in that silence, he felt not just grief, but also gratitude for the camaraderie, for the bonds he'd formed, and for the realization that they were fighting for each other as much as for any cause. That sense of shared purpose stayed with him long after the war, and I think it speaks to the heart of Remembrance Day.
That's incredibly moving, Dennis. Thank you for sharing that. I think it's a story that will resonate with many of us. And thank you for being here today, for sharing your insights, and for helping us all gain a deeper understanding of what Remembrance Day means. It's been a truly special conversation.
Thank you, Abbie. It's always a pleasure, and I hope our discussion today inspires people to reflect, remember, and perhaps even take some time to learn more about the past. It's how we keep those memories alive.
Beautifully put. And with that, we'll wrap up this episode of Book Central Inside the Pages. Whether you're observing Remembrance Day for the first time or it's a long-standing tradition, we hope this conversation gave you something to think about. I'm Abbie, here with Dennis Brooks, reminding you to pause, reflect, and honor those who've given so much. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.